Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to see you. My name is Darek Wójcik. I'm a professor of economic geography at the School of Geography and the Environment here in Oxford and a fellow at St. Peter's College. I'm real, but I'm not the real organizer of this event. The main organizer is Dr. Ben Caldecott from the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment at the School of Geography and the Environment here in Oxford. But he's still traveling from Oslo, as far as we know, and will join us later. But it's my utmost pleasure to stand here in place of Ben to welcome you all and to introduce our keynote speaker who will talk on the future of sustainable finance in Europe. So keynote speaker, Olivier Guersent. So let me just tell you in the way of introduction about the simple exercise I did recently. So I basically collected information on all papers and books, all academic works published on finance in the last 20 years. So this gives you over 100,000 works. And I checked how many of these works also talk about things like development, cities, regions, inequality, or sustainability. And this gives you a result of just hundreds of papers out of over 100,000. So a minute fraction of research, literature, and studies on finance are actually concerned with things that I would think are much more important for the real economy and society than topics such as market microstructure, which is you can find in thousands of papers. Now we are in Oxford, and I think in Oxford there is quite a bit of commitment to new ways of studying finance in general. So the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment runs a sustainable finance program led by Dr. Ben Caldecott. There's the Oxford Sustainable Finance and Investment Network. Side Business School has responsible business initiatives, including sustainable finance. Oxford Martin School, where we are now, has Oxford Martin Net Zero Carbon Investment Initiatives, co-directed by Professor Cameron Hepburn and Professor Miles Allen. And I have the pleasure to chair a global network on financial geography, which is concerned with the impacts of finance on society, economy, and the natural environment. And this is just to name a few initiatives that we have in Oxford, which together hopefully have potential to contribute to the work of the European Commission, among other institutions, hopefully even after Brexit, or despite Brexit, or with Brexit hopefully not happening. You can take whichever option you prefer here. So this takes me to our esteemed keynote speaker, Olivier Guersent, who graduated with distinction from the Institute of Political Sciences in Bordeaux, and then joined the French Ministry of Economy and Finance in 1984. In 1992, he started working with the European Commission, initially with the Merger Task Force in the Directorate General for Competition. And since then, his work has moved between the private offices of a number of European commissioners and the Directorate General for Competition. From 2010 to 2014, he was the head of the private office of Michel Barnier, Commissioner for Internal Market and Services. And Mr. Guersent has also been the Director General of the Directorate General for Financial Stability, Financial Services, Capital Markets Union, a position that he holds, that he has assumed in September 2015. So the plan is that Olivier will speak for about 30 minutes up to 45 minutes, and then we have time for Q&A, about half an hour, and then at 6:15, we will move to drinks next door. So Olivier, it's a pleasure to have you. The floor is yours.
So now you know a couple of things about me. No, I'm old. Actually, kids that are your age, for some of you, not for all of you. And just graduated also from university here in the UK, so That's one more reason to follow with keen interest the Brexit issue. I tick the last box personally, but okay. Right. And you also know that I'm primarily a competition economist. So when I came to finance, my mom asked me why did I do wrong in order to be punished like this? But it's actually quite fascinating. I wouldn't have thought so at the beginning. I worked with Mr. Barnier, and Mr. Barnier, in his previous life, was the commissioner in charge of financial regulation during the crisis. He's now famous for other achievements, or not yet achievements. And I had worked with him previously, and when he knew he would have the portfolio, he called me and invited me for lunch. And before I had time to sit, he told me, I will be commissioner for financial services and will be my head of cabinet, which means chief of staff in European English. And I said, well, I know very little about finance. Well, last time I heard about finance was in university. It was 25 years ago, and it changed a great deal. So no problem, me neither. And this is how we started. And it worked quite well. We did 50 regulations, basically redoing the whole of financial regulation, but we did nothing on sustainable finance. And the reason why we did nothing on sustainable finance is basically twofold. Well, the first one was we were very busy trying to re-regulate the financial sector worldwide after 30 years of deregulation that had brought us to the 2008 crisis. And that was more than enough for 5 years in office. And the second reason is that it was difficult to bring sustainable finance in these days at the forefront of the agenda. The main reason why it would have come anyway, I'm sure, because I will come to that in a second, but the reason why it came so fastly, if you think about it, we were not talking about sustainable finance much 3 years ago. And we know we have a big issue ahead of us for 20 years. So, and the defining factor, in my view, is one person. And that person is Mark Carney. This is Mark that brought it to the forefront in the Financial Stability Board, which is the body that prepares the decision of G20. I'm a member of the steering committee of the FSB. Mark is chairing. And it's really his personal determination that brought it to the forefront, and he's doing quite a lot with the Bank of England in that field as well, and is really leading the move in that field, and is still trying to emulate that in the EU. So, with this introduction, let me now come to the core of the issue. I'll skip all the thing about how bad it is, keeping to the 2-degree or less than 2-degree agenda. I'm sure you know all of this. We in the EU, we have taken a commitment to be in line with the Paris Climate Agreement, with the COP21. So far, I think we're the only ones worldwide, the EU altogether, including the UK, that have met our commitment, because in 2007, the EU decided to cut down the CO2 emissions by 20% by 2020, compared to 1990. And in 2016, so 4 years ahead of time, we had already achieved a 23% reduction. So we had more than met the target. So we have revised the targets, and we now aim at reducing our CO2 emissions by a further 40% by 2030. And we think that target is doable, but it's doable with considerable efforts, and I'll come to this in a second. Yet setting policy target is far from being sufficient to achieve a sustainable transition. There is a broad set of regulatory tools and soft policy tools to achieve those targets, with emission trading schemes, for example, the famous ETS or infamous ETS, and trying to make them work with a price for the carbon ton that reflects economic reality, being one prominent example. So there is a whole policy mix that includes also public investment. I'll come to that in a minute. And within this policy mix, you have sustainable finance, what we call sustainable finance, which is one of the enabling mechanisms that is necessary to achieve a successful transition. This is my area of responsibility, and therefore this is what I will be talking much about tonight. Because if we want to reach this goal to cut by 40% our emission by 2030, we need to make enormous investments. The calculations of the European Commission is that we need to invest 180 to 200 billion euro per year for the next 15 years if we want to meet these targets. So you're way above any measurement of what public budget can do. And that means you have to mobilize private finance. And this is what we're talking about. These investments are spread in a number of areas. Sustainable infrastructure. According to the OECD, infrastructure is responsible for 40% of all greenhouse gas emission. So there is a huge challenge in the field of infrastructure. We need to make our infrastructures more sustainable. That requires gigantic investments. Energy efficiency in buildings, renewable energies, improved waste and water management, greener transport, greener technologies in general. So there are a number of investments to be done in all these fields and more that cannot be made only through public spending. Of course, public spending is extremely important and is one way to help the transition. I mean, as I said, it's a mix of instruments. In 2017, 20% of all EU spending, and I'm talking spending by EU institutions, I'm not talking EU spending instead of the member states, etc., but the spendings at the Commission budget, structural funds, etc., 20% of all this was dedicated to climate protection in general. Way above any measure in member states, actually. If you think about the UK or the French or the German budget, you will not find a figure that is any close to 20%. So the EU, as a federal level, quote unquote, maybe I shouldn't say this in the UK, is doing its job in terms of dedicating funds to climate protection. What we propose for the next period, the next 7 years, is to raise this figure to 25%. Let me give you a number of examples about how we achieve that. But first of all, through grants, but also through what we call the Investment Plan for Europe, best known as the Juncker Plan, with an investment target of €500 billion, 40% of which in sustainable and climate-related investment. But also, and quite importantly, what we call the External Investment Plan, which is the money that we use to help other jurisdictions, other countries, notably in the emerging world, to get developed while not contributing too much to carbon emissions. We have 44 billion available by 2020 to that end. So there is a mix between public means and private means. But you see, even with these big figures, that public means are by far not enough if we want to meet our investment targets in order to be there with the COP21 objectives. So private sector. In Europe, we have around 100 trillion of assets under management. So the financial sector, the European financial sector, is the second in the world, next to the United States of America. And there is a huge potential for green investment. In the end of the day, what is making the financial sector? Well, this is yours, mine, everybody's savings. The financial sector is recycling these savings into a number of use, more or less useful to society. But this is what they're doing. And in Europe, we have more savings than we have ever had in the past. There are reasons for this. We're relatively rich. We are aging, so we care more and more for old age. And we're just out, or maybe not yet out, of a crisis. So in times of uncertainty, people tend to save more. So the short thing is we have a lot of savings. We have a lot of savings, but these savings have a lot of appetite for short term. So now, even irrespective of sustainability issues, savings tend to go to short-term uses, which is completely counterintuitive, because if you save for your old age, you save for the long term. And actually, if you really want to benefit from the long term, you better save for a long-term sustainable future, and therefore invest in sustainable investment. But for some reason, the intermediation doesn't happen, or doesn't happen well enough. One of the things we're trying to do is to restore the incentives for this intermediation to happen better, so that these savings are invested more towards long-term uses and more towards long-term sustainable uses. And this is what our action plan is about. So sustainable finance means basically we have to do two things. We have to mobilize financial resources and orient them towards more sustainable investment. This is what I've just explained. But we also have to mainstream sustainability. We have to embed climate, environmental, and broader sustainability risks into the risk management of companies, and in particular of financial companies. And we need to give investors, so the savers, you, me, everybody, more information and more reliable information about these risks. And this is where we intervene, because this is what you can facilitate through an appropriate policy framework. So for this reason, we have put together in March this year, an action plan, a European action plan, with 10 actions, which are structured around 3 work streams. First, reorient capital flow towards sustainable investment. 2, manage financial risks stemming from social and environmental issues. And 3, foster transparency and long-termism. And within this 3 work stream, we have prioritized 10 actions, and I will explain to you which are the ones we have already started to implement. So let me first say a few words about the 3 legislative actions that we have already proposed, because we think they are the building blocks that will help building the rest of the ecosystem. The first, and in my view the most important one, is what we call the EU taxonomy. What is it? So it is about creating a clear and common understanding of what green and sustainable means across the EU. This is, of course, essential to attract capital, launch green or sustainable financial products, launch new labels, and create incentives, and of course, avoid greenwashing. So what we have proposed is to establish a unified EU classification system, what we call a taxonomy, to identify economic activities that contribute to 6 EU environmental objectives. And then you can enter into the taxonomy through whichever of these objectives you want. So you have one first priority. You should clearly positively contribute to this, say limit carbon emission, and you should not be detrimental to the others. This is how the taxonomy works. So in a way, that's simply a common language, so that when we talk about a sustainable investment, we all talk about the same thing. and you cannot be sold a sustainable investment opportunities that is, in the end of the day, not so sustainable. So that's the goal of all this. And that's, of course, the floor on which we can build a number of other things, label, benchmarks, indexes, what have you. I'll come to this in a second. We will use a number of technical screening criteria in order to define the economic activities that contribute to these environment objectives and thus fall under the EU taxonomy. But you immediately see that this is technical and complex. There are a number of trade-offs. It's not all that easy. Let me take one of my favorite examples. Flat glass producers, the people that are producing these glasses. They may be quite brown in terms of the production process. That depends mainly on the energy they're using, actually. But still, they are producing more and more technical glass that is absolutely indispensable if you want to create passive houses, for example, or simply if you want to renovate existing houses in order to make them energetically, God, that's complicated, efficient. So you don't want to make these companies uninvestable. You don't want to say, oh, they're bad, because you actually need them to continue to do what they do. Actually, you need them to do more of what they do, to do more research in order to have better glasses with better characteristics. So how do you accommodate this? That's one of the issues that the technicians that are working on the taxonomy at the moment, which are not commissioned people. They are academics, they are people from the industry, they are people from NGOs, et cetera, are trying to reconcile. So it's complicated. Let me take you another example. Cars. I'm sure a number of you believe that electric cars are better. So do I. But the least carbon emitting car in the world is not electric, it's a gasoline car. And if I remember correctly, it's a small Korean gasoline car. Because if you take the car over all of the life cycle, from conception to dismantlement and recycling, this is the result of all the calculations. Because, for example, producing batteries is relatively dirty in terms of carbon emissions. So it's not so obvious. And there are a number of trade-offs that need to be cut. This is what the colleagues are currently doing. If they manage, then we will face the political issues. Because in Europe, like elsewhere, member states have their told or untold preferences. In my country, France, people tend to think that nuclear is green. Well, the only thing you can say is that nuclear doesn't emit primarily greenhouse gases. Green is probably far-fetched, but that is true. So it's probably necessary to transit. I'm not sure I would like to live in a nuclearized world forever. But okay. In Germany, they tend to believe, or at least some people tend to believe, that you can have green coal. I have a difficulty to understand what green coal is, but some people believe it is. And of course, when you will come to the political aspects of the taxonomy, we will have to reconcile all these views around the table. That's one of the beauties of the European constructions, is that you have this. So if you're in Poland and you're very dependent on coal, you don't have the same view as if you're in France and you're very dependent on nuclear. But okay, let's try to square the technical circle and we will face the political issues later. But we already have a flavor of that. And to be fair, we're trying to keep the member states very closely informed about the technical work in order to try to avoid running into too much of a political issue after this. And for the time being, it works relatively well because everybody is aware that we cannot afford to fail. So who will be affected by the EU taxonomy? Of course, financial market participants offering financial products, in particular those that market their products as environmentally sustainable. These ones will be directly affected, because one thing we do not want to see is that you market yourself as environmentally friendly, and in reality you're not so. So I'll come to this in a moment, but for this category of market participants, there will be a hard obligation to disclose, using the taxonomy, how they reach or do not reach their environmental objectives. They will have to provide information on how the criteria developed in the taxonomy are used and how they determine their environmental sustainability objectives for their product in that respect. But I hope that the taxonomy will have an impact much beyond that, and in fact much beyond Europe. I think the taxonomy should be an enabler, a common good, if you wish. If we manage to develop a robust and clear taxonomy in the EU, that will be, of course, a useful tool for financial market, but that the goal in the end of the day is to manage, through this common language, to be able to create deep and liquid financial markets in the EU and outside of the EU. And it's extremely interesting that the biggest Japanese pension fund publicly declared that once the EU taxonomy will be in place, they will use it in Japan. The foreign jurisdiction that is most interesting by this work for the time being is China. So this is what I mean when I say I see it as a common good. I think we should develop it as open source. We should develop it, we start it, and then we should put it on the table of the international standard setters for discussion and use. Because the best thing that could happen to this taxonomy, if we manage to make it work, is that it becomes a world standard. Two things. That doesn't mean there is no life outside of the taxonomy. Because, of course, what you don't want to create straitjacket effects that everything is not the taxonomy cannot be invested, because there may be very useful things for climate outside of the taxonomy. So you need also to find a way to accommodate this. And the second thing is that this is an area in which things move very quickly. The taxonomy is very dependent on technology, and technology evolves constantly and very quickly. So you also need to have a feedback loop so that the taxonomy doesn't correspond to the state of the art of yesterday or the day before yesterday. Because if you do that, well, first of all, either it will not be used or it actually will slow down the pace of decarbonation. So for this, what we plan to do is that market participants, if they believe the taxonomy in one of its components is not the best standard or is not up to date, they may use another one. The obligation they would have in that respect is to disclose it to the supervisors. A supervisor will feed back into the commission. We will process it. If it is superior, we will integrate it. If it is not superior, then the supervisor will deal with the financial company in question. But we think it is appropriate to allow innovation. If you think your standard is superior to the one in the taxonomy, you should be able to use it, and you should inform us because we should be able to benefit from it. Of course, if it's not superior, and this is our conclusion, then you should have to face the consequences. So this is very much work in progress, but you immediately see that this is really the grammar, the common language on which we can build a full ecosystem of different things. Let me come now to this. For example, and that's the second proposal we put forward in May this year, investors' duties and disclosure. You need also to have a common understanding of what it is you need to disclose and what it is you don't need to disclose. And for this, the taxonomy may also be quite useful. What we see today is that many institutional investors and asset managers still do not systematically integrate or disclose environmental, social, or governance, so-called ESG, factors in their investment process, and that the number of companies that are doing so is increasing, but it is increasing very slowly. We will try to make it a bit faster. What we propose is to require asset managers, insurance undertakings, insurance distributors, occupational pension funds, but also investment advisors and individual portfolio managers to disclose information on how they integrate ESG factors in their investment and in their advisory process. We will also clarify investors' duties regarding sustainability matters. So, and here as well, asset managers and institutional investors that offer products that are marketed as sustainable will have to disclose how they achieve the stated sustainability objectives. So, in other words, the logic of the thing is that everybody is subjected to a duty to refer to the factors and explain how they took it into account. But if you market yourself as being sustainable or having a sustainable fund, then you have a tougher obligation. You have to explain how, according to the methodology, you intend to meet these objectives. The third proposal has to do with benchmarks. And you see that it's the same logic. It's how you start from a common definition, common language, and you transfer it into information for investors, comparable information for investors, so that, the meaning of each term is the same, whoever is using it. So you as an investor can compare the information you receive in terms of environmental performance from Fund A and Fund B. And if your preference is, if you have a preference for decarbonation, soft probably, you may have a hard preference for yield, then you have the means to translate it into your investment decision. For the time being, there are a number of benchmarks, let's call them traditional benchmarks. And these benchmarks may reflect sustainability goals or not, but when they reflect them, it's usually only to a very limited degree. Of course, some index providers have been developing benchmarks to capture sustainability, but usually the lack of transparency regarding their methodologies negatively affects their reliability, and of course that increases greenwashing risks. So what we propose is to introduce disclosure requirements for ESG benchmarks. It will also define minimum standards for methodologies for what we call low carbon and positive carbon impact benchmarks. Low carbon benchmark, in short, is based on decarbonizing the existing standard benchmark. So the underlying stocks would be selected on account of their reduced carbon emissions when compared to the stocks constituting a standard benchmark. Conversely, the positive carbon impact benchmark is a more ambitious thing. It is aligned with the second Paris Agreement objective of limiting temperature below 2-degree increase. So the underlying stocks are selected on account of their carbon emission savings exceeding the stock's residual carbon footprint. So like this, as an investor, you can modulate your investment strategy. And again, that will give you benchmarks that are based on a known and certified and methodology. So these three proposals are currently being negotiated by the European legislators, so that's the European Parliament on the one hand, and the member states in the Council on the other. I save you the details of this negotiation. But I'm pleased to say that it's as usual in the European negotiations. It's complicated. Everybody has a number of objectives, and the trick is to manage to find a compromise. But this is one of the few issues in which you can see that member states share a sense of urgency. So there is a real willing to work together in order to be able to adopt these proposals, make them legislation, before the parliament leaves to campaign, which is in April next year. So the time remaining is very, very short, and it is therefore very, very challenging. On the side of the European Parliament, it is relatively clear. I mean, the European Parliament is ambitious in terms of fighting global warming, and they tend to be willing to strengthen the proposal of the Commission, which is good, because probably in the Council side, some will be willing to lower the degree of ambition, so we may end up in a not too bad place if the Parliament is willing to strengthen it. So far so good, but it's far from being a done deal that we will be able to do this before April. If we do not manage, then the legislative works will resume basically in March 2020. It's not that the Parliament will do nothing in between. They first will get elected in June. They then will choose the new President of the Commission. And they then will have to hear and vote, or not vote, the new College of Commissioners, individually, one after the other. That takes quite some time. They usually do not vote one or two of them, which takes even further time, because then the member states have to redesignate new people, and these new people have to be heard as well and voted in. And all this may well bring us to the beginning of 2020. And I told you, we have a window, if we want to reach our target, we have a window of 10 years. So that's not much. So we don't think we can afford to lose one, to be clear. That's why we are rushing all this. Let me finish by telling you about a couple of other important work streams. First of all, we are working on the definition of a European green bond standard. Why a European green bond standard? Because you have many green bond standards. It works fine. Well, the problem is that currently companies that are issuing green bonds, it's really an act of faith, because it's usually more expensive to issue green bonds than to issue normal bonds. So in other words, if I'm a regular EU company and I want to finance a sustainable investment, if I issue regular company bonds, the cost of issuance will be less than if I issue green bonds. So it's really, I pay a price in order to show that I'm committed. It's fine, but that shouldn't be. If you don't want it to be like this, then you need to standardize and massify the green bond market. That's the reason why. It will not be a compulsory standard, it will be a voluntary standard, but we have great hope that this standard will be adhered to for reasons of efficiency of scale and scope. We want to use the existing European eco-labels that is used for a variety of products. We want to label as well financial products with this. So that needs a bit of work with the agency, the European agency that is in charge of it. And this work is ongoing. Likewise, there is a huge work stream because the biggest problem is the lack of data from issuers. So the biggest problem, if you want, I mean, you have money, you want to invest in sustainable finance, it's very difficult to find the data. So this is also something we are working on. It is a real challenge for investors. And we are currently assessing existing reporting requirements to see how we could modify them in order to provide the market with the data necessary, and then I'm sure once the data is available, the industry will manage ways to add value to it and process it in order to give value for money to investors. We're doing many other things, some of which are controversial, like creating what we call a green supporting factor. What is a green supporting factor? That means, as banks, when you invest into assets, you usually have a capital charge that you have to keep as liability in order to guarantee that. It's a factor of the risk attributed to the underlying asset. We propose to lower artificially this charge if it's a sustainable investment. The criticism that is made to this approach is that, of course, you mix the risk signal to investor. Normally, the capital charge is here to tell the investor, well, look, if you invest in this asset, because it is more risky, it will cost you more, basically, because you will have to segregate that capital charge. So when you start to mixing that signal with a policy signal towards a sustainable investment, a number of people are nervous with this. The truth is we have started to see a long time ago, because there are a number of existing supporting factors, and in particular for SMEs, that the Council and the Parliament are currently willing to hire. And one thing that can be said is that there is no research that shows that investment in SMEs is massively less risky than investing in, say, infrastructure, for example. But we still believe this is something we should do. Of course, in pure economic logic, this is not what you should do. You should actually penalize brown investment. At least that's my view. My view is that the job of the policymakers is to force market participants to internalize negative externalities. So in other words, if you want to invest into a massively polluting device, of course, that's your freedom. It's a free market, it's a free economy, it's a free society, but it's more costly. Because we force you to internalize and appropriate that cost. That is a cost for society, but it's not an individual cost for the investing company or the investing individual. In doing so, of course, you change the incentives of the investor, and in trying to maximize its profits, it will tend to behave in a socially desirable way. So this is what we do with taxes, and I say my view is that this is what we should do with prudential requirements. And putting a green supporting factor is a proxy to this. And the reason for this is that it's politically a lot more easy to give a bonus to green than to penalize brown. If we start with a brown penalizing factor, that's more logical, that's great that's beautiful from a conceptual point of view, but in 10 years we will still be negotiating that legislation, and in 10 years the window will be closed. So we cannot afford that, and that's why we went from the easy solution and the green supporting factor. So I will spare you my conclusions in the interest of the question time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olivier. So now we can move here. Would you like to sit down for the Q&A? So thank you for this talk that covered a lot of ground in terms of structural factors that affect the development of sustainable finance, as well as the very important role of leadership, as you mentioned at the beginning. Also, personally, I've always felt, even when the global financial crisis started, that one of its biggest negative effects would be that it would delay the sustainability agenda. And I'm sad to hear that your experience confirms this observation. So I'm sure you have generated a lot of comments and questions, provoked a lot of thoughts about this topic. So please, who would like to start? Please.
There's a mic. And that gives me the opportunity to thank Ben and Lizzie for their invitation.
Hi, I'm Joanna from Imperial College. So you talked about short-termism and the need for long-term sustainable investments. And we have a debate coming up on Friday, and it talks precisely about whether it's better to invest in large renewable infrastructures that have an environmental impact now, or whether we need to think about the long-term meeting goals agenda that we have that is time critical. And what do you think about that? And should you have maybe what you'd call the punishment for the negative impact that it has in the short term? What do you think? How do you reconcile those two?
Well, I'm a pragmatic. So, I mean, what we know is probably, or at least it is more and more challenging to reach the less than 2 degree. At some point it will become impossible. And then it will become more and more challenging to reach the 2 degree. And at some point, even this will become impossible, etc., etc. So my answer would be, I don't really care. I mean, what I know is that we know where we need to be in terms of carbon emission in 2030 if we want to be on the 1.5 degree path. We know where we need to be if we want to be on a 2 degree path. And whatever will bring us there, I would take, frankly. So I think it's not all that complicated in the end of the day. Yes, of course, you may have short-term cost. I mean, if you build a plant for batteries or hydrogen cells or what have you, that emits carbon. That is clear. But we have the technology now to be able to computate the life cycle carbon emissions of this. And what matters to me is the savings. So, for example, that's one of the issues. The issue you're talking about is at the core of the discussions we have in taxonomy, of course. My personal view, but it's not the view of everybody, but my personal view is, I say, well, look, for the time being, I would go for the biggest savings. So I would include in the taxonomy a company that is very, very brown, and that would become just brown by, say, halving its emissions. Because the game I'm in for the next 10 years is how much do we gain? So in other words, it matters more to me a very brown industrial company that becomes just brown than an already green that remains green. Because I gain nothing. I don't want the green to become brown, of course, but I gain nothing. And what I need to do is I need to halve the emissions. So I need big gains. So that's why, I mean, I think you should forget about values and all this. What is the goal? The goal is to be there in 2030, there in 2040, and zero, arguably, in 2050. How do we get there?
My name's John Ditchfield, so I am an intermediary. So I deal with private investor savings, pension schemes. So I provide the advice that leads to an investment into a sustainable fund or not. Firstly, I'd like to say certainly the development of the taxonomy is a fascinating innovation. I think that's got enormous potential to move the market and move more capital in the direction of the high-quality sustainability funds and products which exist. That's accepted. I think the significant risk here, though, is that certainly in the UK, my experience is all in the UK, so I'm speaking about the UK market. All of this activity is already, it's largely intermediated, so it's only a very small percentage of the population that actually go out and buy these products as individuals. That is growing, but that's the way the market breaks up, that you've got a lot of intermediaries who operate there. They already have very significant regulatory duties and will typically issue a pension scheme or a private individual with an enormous raft of compliance material as part of the sales process. So I think the big risk here is that if the intermediaries aren't, buying into the process, they'll just sink this into the part of the regulatory, part of the compliance requirements, and the communication doesn't then happen, which is absolutely key to seeing a real buy-in. I think the curio here is that private individuals overwhelmingly want these types of sustainability-focused products and services, and they want a high-quality sustainability product. It's actually the intermediaries who often they're often the source of this market failure, I would say. And if the solution is, certainly the taxonomy is part of that, but if it becomes more regulation, and if it's built into what are called key investor information documents, which are already huge, very complicated disclosure documents, then it will be completely lost. So I hope that's not a, negative. It's just based on practical experience of what actually goes on in the marketplace. Thank you.
Well, to the risk of surprising you, I agree. I think with the best intents for the time being, we have, well, KIDS, maybe not everybody knows what KIDS is. It's so-called key information document, so it's meant to protect investors, in particular private investors. For reasons that are idiosyncratic to legislative processes, first of all, it tends to overdevelop. And secondly, you have slightly different versions depending on what you invest into, or actually even if you invest into the same product, depending on the channel you're using. So all this creates a huge burden on intermediaries, but also on investors. I mean, I wanted to test it myself, so I took a weekend to fill in all the papers, and I convinced myself we should review this. So I agree with you. Second, I mean, you're right. I mean, it is true that the risk is a sort of tick-the-box thing, or overburdening, say, the kids, with the result that in the end of the day, you prefer to buy a house and rent it because it's a lot less burdensome. All this is true. On the other hand, all this is also used as an excuse by those that do not want it to happen. I'm not saying this is your case, but so both are true. This is my experience. And of course, the solution to this is that we need to make it smart enough. I wouldn't say light enough, because it's not a question of being light, but practicable enough for this excuse not to exist, basically. And that's a challenge, because doing simple is not what we do best in the European Union, usually. And mainly because, to be frank and to defend my institution, what gets out of the Commission is usually reasonably workable because it's based on wide consultations of the industry, etc. And after this, you have to make 28 member states to agree. And they have all their own way to do it in their own markets for decades. And they don't want to lose it. So the result is invariably something quite complicated. That's true. For as long as we will remain 28 nations with our preferences, with our ways of doing things, which I think is part of our value added as well, it will be like this, unfortunately. So the price we pay is complexity. But you're right, still within this, we need to make it sufficiently simple and practicable so that it's used and it's taken up. This is why we are not only putting high-level obligations on issuers and investors, we are putting a number of duties on people like you, so the intermediaries. And we're trying to be a bit smarter than last time by putting exactly the same ones, whatever the channel is. Because as you know, for the time being, depending whether you distribute insurance or whether you distribute exactly the same product, but it's not called an insurance, you're subjected to slightly different obligations. We're trying to get rid of this. And that's simply that the obligations you have as an advisor to an investor in terms of sustainability is relatively simple and workable, standardized, so that if I see you, but then if I want to compare with what the next guy in town will tell me, I can compare, and sufficiently simple so that we don't face the criticism, well, look, we would love to use it, but we don't.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Hi.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Anna. I'm here from the European University Institute in Rome, in Florence, sorry. Thanks very much for your presentation. Going through the two documents, so the document from the high-level expert group and then the action plan, as a sort of a social scientist, my concern was with two things. Firstly, that this talk about sustainable finance, at least in the high-level expert group, the emphasis is really on a two-step process of first working on the sustainable and then talking about the more political, social and governance that may come later on. That two-step dimension, I think, is mentioned maybe once or twice in the action plan, but it doesn't seem to come through very much. Could you tell us or talk to us a little bit about that? And then the second thing is about the institutions, I suppose. So this kind of initiative, I imagine, would require a great deal of institutional support. In the original high-level expert group document, there was talk of an observatory, I understand, and there was a fairly kind of concrete set of, they weren't exactly terms of references, but a set of, numbers of people who were going to be employed by it, a number of, millions of euros that were going to be going towards that observatory. And then in the action plan, it says something like that the governance mechanism or the organisation that is to somehow govern this is going to kind of be put together after the legislative proposals, I think, put forward. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because it seems from a really kind of concrete perspective of just trying to understand who's doing what, that it's not super clear, at least from the action plan or the previous document, who's exactly doing what and how that will change with time as well.
Okay, well, as you may have noted from the presentation, I used to be a political scientist as well. So here is a bit of practice. The HLEG, so the high-level group, gave its reports in late January, and the action plan was issued in beginning March. So if you look at, what is normally political or administrative political time, it's quite fast. The reason why it is quite fast is, I explain, is the situation is that in April, if we're lucky, a bit less than a year, if you're unlucky, a year, we will not be able to pass legislation anymore. So we needed to go fast and we needed to make priorities. The governance of the long-term administration of the whole thing as the prospect for a 10 years discussion. This is what the politics of it will play. So we did not prioritize this because we thought if we do this, we will spend the very limited time we have only discussing this. And in April next year, we will not have resolved that part and we will have done nothing else. Because that will freeze all the rest, because the member states will not move in substance if there is a governance issue on the table before they have resolved it. They want to know where they're going to. They want to know who is going to control the whole thing. They want to know all this. And this will be the focus of everything. And the result would have been, maybe it will be the result anyhow, but we wanted to give ourselves every chance to make a difference in substance. So that's why we deprioritize the issue of governance. Doesn't mean it's not important. I told you I'm a pragmatic. So I make my priorities in function of my constraints. And these were my constraints. So we shall see later with this. Will we have an observatory? A number of people. The other problem with observatory is that tell you things usually you don't want to hear. So that's why many people do not like observatories. And they even like less independent observatories. They may agree to an observatory provided it is within that structure If it is outside and independent, well, not so much. So we shall see. You know, in Europe, you don't do anything if you don't basically get an appropriation, and in the end of the day, a commitment on adhesion by the member states. And hopefully by the people within the member states. That's another story. But at least by the member states as institutions. So you need to manage that. And frankly, the core issues are difficult enough. I mean, think about the taxonomy. Think about, I mean, I told you in my remarks, countries that are 70% of their power generation depending on nuclear, or more than 50% on coal. We will have enough to deal with in terms of hard political issues that will necessitate a lot of goodwills from everybody to be solved without being drawn into endless governance discussions. These discussions we will have to have because they're absolutely crucial for the long term. But for the short term, they're not so important. What we want to do is to have a governance in which there is a constant appropriation and feedback loop between the technical level and the member states. You need to explain to the member states what we're doing, why you are doing it. You need to involve them. They need to be part of it. If they're just clients of some EU structure, that may work as well, but that will take a lot more time. And we don't have this time. So that's the reason why we made these choices. Like any choice, we could have made others that may have been just as valid, maybe more valid. But these are the choices we made, and this is why.
We have next question here. And please, if I may ask you to keep questions relatively short so we can squeeze in more questions for everyone's benefit, please.
Thanks, Stephanie Pfeiffer from the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, and ex-student here. I just had a question. I have two questions, actually. Is it, in terms of the politics, is it just the usual suspects that you think will cause problems, or is it also France, Germany, and some of the other states that are normally very supportive of these issues? And second question is, if you're asking the investors to use the taxonomy, are you going to get companies to disclose against the same regulations so that the investors can use that data then in their own processes? In terms of the activities that you're sort of coming up with for the taxonomy, are you going to get companies to disclose along the same lines so that investors have sort of readily available data that they can then use? Thanks.
Okay, I start with the second one. For the time being, we don't foresee mandatory disclosure. For the time being. The same way as actually the TCFD doesn't foresee mandatory disclosure, and it works quite well. I mean, actually, I think we are entering a world in which, in particular, if we start to mainstream sustainability and or without the taxonomy into public funding. I told you about the EU, but more and more member states are doing it. The discussions now in the budgetary discussions in the EP, in the European Parliament, sorry, are about do you mainstream it in structural funds, for example? And as you know, the rule there is co-financing. So the multiplier effect is quite huge. To give you an example, the multiplier effect of the Juncker plan is times 15. So each euro, initial euro of EU investment, EU money, generated 15 euro of investment. If you have a conditionality on the one initial euro, you have a conditionality on the 15. So this plus the pressure of investors makes that more and more companies tend to disclose voluntarily anyway. What we want to do now is to force them to disclose voluntarily with a comparable or same methodology. And the third step, one day maybe, when the evolution of mind is ready for this, might be to compel. We start already by accompanying those that market themselves as sustainable. So, as I said, we make clearly that distinction. Everybody has to disclose at a certain level. If you market yourself as sustainable, and if you tell investors, well, look, I'm very green, then you will have to prove it, and you will have to prove it according to the standardized methodology. But we don't foresee to do more for the time being. Then, in terms of the politics of it, I don't want to stigmatize any specific member states. I mean, all member states have their idiosyncrasies. They're all very virtuous in certain fields and not so virtuous in others. They have also to arbitrate between short-term and long-term. This was your question. Sadly, usually you arbitrate in favor of short-term. And one of the things we're trying to change here is the balance of incentives and disincentives so that you are more incentives to arbitrate in favor of longer-term issues. And that's probably why the discussions are difficult. But as I said, I mean, the good thing is, I would say in the last, well, since COP21 in Paris, basically, minds have switched in the member states. It is clear that the degree of awareness in treasuries, which are the guys that are negotiating this for the member states, is much higher than it used to be. I mean, the whole thing starts to be dangerously close. I mean, we're not talking anymore about an indistinct future somewhere. We're talking about basically our children and grandchildren, so people start to understand better.
Hi, I'm Mike Wilkins, Head of Sustainable Finance at S&P Global Ratings. I was intrigued by your comment about the European Green Bond Standard and the rationale behind that being that you wanted to sort of level the playing field in terms of costs of issuing green bonds, because the evidence that we've seen to a large extent shows that it actually gives a cost of capital advantage to issue green versus non-green. In fact, today there was some report which showed evidence from the sovereign green bond issued by Belgium, the 4.5 billion green bond issued recently, which the Belgian government says is saving it €1 million per annum in interest costs relative to a non-green bond. So that would suggest somewhere in the region of a 2.2 basis point advantage of issuing green versus non-green. So based on that, and based on other evidence in the corporate world where we've seen a 2 to 3 basis point advantage for green bonds versus non-green bonds, I'm a bit intrigued to understand why you need a European green bond standard to level the playing field.
Well, I would invite you then to review the impact assessment that is published, because that's not the evidence we reviewed when we launched the thing. So maybe it has changed since. That's the problem with these things. You review, say, 2 years from now, then you consult, and then you start working, and then you'll know at the moment when you actually manufacture the standard, 3 years later, and maybe probably the market has moved. That's a problem we have all the time. So you suggest we stop? Good. We have many other things to do.
Hi, Caroline Barraclough. I work with CDP at EIT, Climate Kick, a few other organisations. Really happy to hear what you said about disclosure, making that mandatory within a reasonably short time frame. Just wondering, were you referring to using something like the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and integrating that into all private companies' sort of legal requirements for reporting? And can you tell me a bit more about that?
I think you're so enthusiastic that you hear things I didn't say. I didn't say that we will make it mandatory short term. I'm afraid.
It needs to be.
I don't say that I wouldn't like to do it, but this is not what I said. And I don't know whether we will be. I don't know whether it will be desirable to do it, and I don't know whether we will be able to do it. What is true is that The TCFD standard is different from what we're doing with the taxonomy, and actually both, it's complementary. It's not competing, because there should be a world outside of the taxonomy. Because taxonomy is meant to be, the big tickets, the big impact things. So what would be not good is that you crowd out that end of the market, and then you make a number of the things that are desirable to invest in, making it more difficult for them to attract investment. And this is where disclosure, according to the TCFD principles, is important. But what you see with the TCFD is that it's not mandatory. It's not actually mandatory anywhere in the world, and it's gaining grounds big time. So for as long as it happens like this, we're monitoring it, we're seeing how it works. I don't think we'll do more than this short term, because this works. And there are a number of things other things that are broken and we need to make work. We have limited time, we have limited means. So what the market has appropriated without us having to intervene, actually it's better, frankly. If it stopped to work, in our view, in a productive way, then maybe we will think about doing something else. But for the time being, this is not where we are. I mean, we have quite a lot on the plate with what is foreseen already in the action plan. It will be challengeable. It will be a big challenge to deliver it. You should understand that the organization that I'm leading is a very small organization. It's 350 people. And as we say, 350 people is big. Yeah, but I mean, these 350 people deal with credit rating agencies, with auditing firms, with banks, with insurance, with pension funds, with asset managers, with central clearing, with uncleared derivatives, with whatever. So that means and these worlds are different. If you're a specialist in bank regulation, you may know very little about asset management and the other way around. So that means that for each of these specialty, I can rely on, say, 20 professionals. So I have to choose my battles, basically.
It's a good note to finish on, because that's all time we had for Q&A. So thank you, Olivier, for answering the questions so candidly. As I mentioned, the whole event has been organized by the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. So in addition to thanking Olivier Guersent, I would like to thank Dr. Lise Harnett and others from the Smith School for hosting us here. And this is not the end. We have, for the next half an hour, drinks sponsored by the school next door. Thank you very much.
Thank you.